Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. So today I'm very happy to share with you the finding of my research paper with the title Beyond the Disaster Zone: How Disruptive Climate Events Shape EPA Oversight and Firm Behavior. So recently, there are growing concerns about the negative impact of climate change, natural disasters, and how pollution caused by corporate activities could be a contributing factor of the accelerating climate change. So this leads to increased attention to the role and effectiveness of environmental regulators around the world. In the United States, the environmental regulators is the EPA, which stands for Environmental Protection Agency. It is charged with the role to protect human health and the environment. And over the years, the EPA has written hundreds of millions of regulations that have large impacts on firms, for example, the Clean Air Act. So in order to make sure that firms actually comply with these environmental regulations, the EPA carrying out monitoring activities in the form of inspections. So the EPA officers will visit the sites, talk to the representatives, observe operations, review the records, etc. However, the decision-making behind these monitoring activities and how they impact firms are still largely under-researched and underexplored. We know that the EPA officer will rely on their risk assessment, which is how likely a particular facility is not in compliance with environmental regulations, to determine their monitoring effort. However, we also know that there is a lot of discretion during this process. So according to a recent Government Accountability Office report, the EPA officer also relied heavily on their personal experiences and knowledge to determine their monitoring activities. As such, it is very important for us to understand how experience affects EPA monitoring effort, and this is exactly the research questions we're going to look at today. To answer this question, we leverage the setting of the occurrences of major hurricanes. Major hurricanes are disruptive events that can cause large damages. And these are exogenous events because they're still impossible to be accurately predict, despite the improvement in the science and technology. Prior research has shown that human beings, after exposed to major hurricanes, which are very traumatic, they will change their risk perception, which is how likely they think the risks are there outside the world, and they will change their decision-making. And for the EPA officers, major hurricanes is a type of event that is very relevant to their role and responsibility. So what you see here is a photo of some EPA officers inspecting a site in the aftermath of the Hurricane Katrina in the state of New Orleans. So we believe that major hurricanes could be a type of event that will affect the EPA officers after they experience it and affect their risk perception and the way they carry out their monitoring activities. So if this is the case, we want to ask a follow-up research question. That is, how do firms respond to this EPA's monitoring effort? This question is hard to be examined in a usual setting because a lot of the time, it is these firms' underlying characteristics that drive EPA's regulatory attention. So whatever outcome we observe from the firm side might not be driven purely by EPA's monitoring effort. So by looking at the major hurricanes, it can provide us with a setting to look at an exogenous event that causes a change in EPA's monitoring effort so that we can better understand how firms respond to EPA monitoring. So to answer our research question, we are going to focus on EPA's monitoring effort in the zones that are not hit by the disasters. The reason is that we want to isolate the impact of the disaster itself from the EPA's experience from the disaster that is actually driving the change in monitoring effort. So ex ante, it's hard to tell whether and how these major hurricanes will affect EPA's monitoring efforts in the facilities located in areas that are not hit by the disasters. So on the one hand, we might not expect to see any change because these type of disasters are exogenous and also short-lived. So it is not going to change the actual compliance risk of the facilities located in areas beyond the disaster zone. And it is not likely that these areas now become more likely to be hit by hurricanes as well. So there's no reason to believe that the EPA is going to change their way of doing things in these zones. However, we might also expect that the EPA would decrease their monitoring effort because now their attention and resource might be diverted to the disaster zone to rebuild and to inspect the aftermath, such as the damages. So it could be that we are not going to find any effect, or the EPA would decrease their monitoring effort in the non-disaster zone. But on the other hand, we might expect to see an increase in the monitoring effort by the EPA office. Because according to prior research, after experiencing such disruptive climate events, people's risk perception will change. So even if there is no actual change in the risk, the EPA officer might think that now the facilities are at a higher risk of getting non-compliant status. And the consequence of their non-compliance now become more severe. For example, if a type of chemical is not stored properly, then after the hurricane, they could flow with the flood and contaminate many areas. So now the EPAs might be motivated to increase their monitoring effort even when the facilities are not located or affected by the disaster. So our hypothesis is in a null form that EPA regulators who experience disruptive climate events will not change their monitoring efforts at the facilities not struck by the disaster zone under their jurisdiction. So to test our hypothesis, we leverage the fact that the EPA is actually not a single entity. It operates in the form of regional offices across the United States. So there are in total 10 regional offices, and each of them are in charge of the monitoring activities of several states. So for example, EPA Regional Office 9 oversees the compliance in the states of California, Nevada, Arizona, and Hawaii, and some other territories. So for our story, let's assume that there is EPA Regional Office 1 and 2. EPA Regional Office 1 oversees counties A, B, and E, while EPA Regional Office 2 oversees counties C and D. If in a particular year, a major hurricane hit County A and caused a large damage, which we define as having a more than $1 million in property damage at the county level, then we're going to say that EPA Regional Office 1, who is in charge of County A, now has experienced a major disaster. And they might change the way they monitor their facilities, even if the facilities is outside the disaster zone. So now we're going to look at County B, which is overseen by Regional Office 1 as the treatment facility. And we're going to compare the monitoring activities in County B to the other control counties, which are County C and D, which are overseen by EPA Regional Office 2, who has not experienced any disasters during this same period. One thing we want to highlight is that we're going to exclude County E, which is also overseen by Regional Office 1, but it's close to County A, so that it is possible that County E would be indirectly affected by the disaster itself as well. So the point here is that we really want to capture the type of monitoring effort that is coming from the change in EPA Regional Office 1's experience with the disaster. So to gather the data by major hurricanes, we identify all the hurricanes with names because these hurricanes are usually more damaging. So as we can see here is an example of some of the hurricanes in our sample. And on average, these hurricanes are very disruptive. They affect a lot of counties, leads to a lot of human life loss, and causes a very big damages in property damage. So what do we find? We find that after an EPA regional office experienced a major hurricane under its jurisdiction, it increased its monitoring effort. So for a facility that is overseen by an exposed EPA regional office, even if it is not in a disaster zone, now it is 20% more likely to be inspected. And the inspections is also more intense, measured by the length of inspections, which has significantly increased after the disaster. We also find similar finding when we look at the EPA's activity at the county level, where counties that is treated now receive significantly more inspections compared to control counties. So if we look at the trend, we will see that this increase in inspection intensity and frequency only appear since the year of major disaster, which is period 0 on the graph, and it persists into the future 2 years. So we find that after the EPA regional office exposed to the disaster, it actually increased their monitoring effort even beyond the disaster zone. We also find that this effect is stronger if the EPA regional office location is closer to the disaster center so that it is more affected. And also if they have a larger budget so that they could have the resource to carry out these increased monitoring activities. So how do firms respond to this increase in monitoring effort? We carry out a methodology called a two-stage least square regression, where in the first stage, we're going to isolate the part of inspections that is induced by the occurrence of disasters. And then in the second stage, we're going to look at how firm pollution changed in response to this more exogenous increase in inspection by the EPA office. What do we find? We find that the facilities reduce their pollution in the future 3 years after their EPA regional office experienced a disaster. And this type of pollution has positive environmental outcome because we find that there are fewer environmental complaints in the counties that are overseen by the experienced EPA regional office about pollution. So it looks like everything is great. However, is it really the case? We zoom into firms' strategy, and we find that actually firms ship their pollution from the facilities overseen by the exposed EPA regional office to the other facilities that are overseen by a not affected EPA regional office. We find that these firms in these not affected facilities, their pollution actually increase. So these results suggest that the locally heightened regulatory monitoring efforts can actually have unintended spillover effects to the other areas. So to conclude, our results find that saline experience actually affect EPA's monitoring effort. After the EPA regional office exposed to a major hurricane, they increase their inspection activities, even in places that is not hit by the disaster directly. And we also find that such increase in monitoring effort has real effects. It helps to reduce the toxic chemical releases at the regulated areas, and it leads to better environmental outcomes. However, we also find that this improvement in environmental outcome is local. Firms will ship their pollutions to areas overseen by a non-exposed EPA regional office who has not experienced the disaster. So overall, our results highlight an intended spillover effect of a locally heightened EPA monitoring efforts and the importance of coordinations among different regional offices in order to achieve a desired environmental outcome. So that's the end of my sharing today, and thank you very much.